Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the cursed Asylum of Bedlam and the living nightmare it was built to contain that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The first warning was not written in ink, but in fire, etched into the decaying, moisture-stained plaster of Bedlam Asylum's west wing. The words were not carved by a human hand, but scorched into existence, as if branded by a fevered heat that originated from within the wall itself. The plaster around the inscription was blistered and blackened, the ash clinging to the letters still carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of sulfur, a smell of brimstone that clung to the air like a shroud. They locked the doors. The inscription read, the script a frantic, jagged scroll. But they didn't lock what was inside. It wasn't to keep the patients in. It was to keep something else from getting out. The man believed to be its author was discovered beside his creation, a silent effigy to a truth no one dared speak. His body was slumped against the wall in an attitude of grim repose, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting a horror that had burned out his soul long before his life had ceased. The true masterpiece of the scene, however, lay in the cup of his palm. His own tongue, expertly and impossibly excised, rested there as a final macabre offering. Official records, the few that weren't immediately redacted or destroyed by the asylum's secretive administration, noted the utter impossibility of the event. The room had been locked from the inside. The man had possessed no tools, no weapon, and had received no visitors for over a year. He was simply another nameless casualty in a place that specialized in erasing names. Another soul methodically swallowed by an institution whose hunger was insatiable. This, then, was the true welcome to the place history knows as Bedlam, not the sanitized, scholarly entity of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, the name spoken of in the dusty, self-congratulatory textbooks of British medicine. This was the real Bedlam, the one they buried beneath layers of official histories, the one they sealed with cement and silence. It was a place built upon ancient, unhallowed ground, a patch of London soil where something had been whispering in the dark long before the first brick was laid, long before its walls ever echoed with the first symphony of human screams. History, as told by the victors and the sane, is often a story of convenience, a clean, well-lit narrative smoothed over to protect the powerful and forget the damned. On paper, in royal charters and parliamentary records, Bedlam's purpose was to house the mentally afflicted, to offer a compassionate sanctuary from a world that did not understand their fractured minds. But this was merely a functional lie, a respectable facade for a far more sinister and deliberate enterprise. From its earliest days, Bedlam was a feeding ground, a banquet hall for horrors of every kind, both human and otherwise. It fed the corrupt physicians who grew wealthy from suffering, their methods a blend of ignorance and cruelty, from bleeding and purging to crude restraints that broke the body as much as the spirit. It fed the morbid curiosity of the powdered aristocrats who, for the price of a few shillings, would tour the wards as a weekend diversion, with perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, They would peer through the iron bars at the spectacle of madness, treating human agony as if it were a circus. Their laughter and jeers, a sound of casual cruelty, became just another layer in the asylum's oppressive soundscape. But the asylum's ultimate purpose was to feed something else entirely, something older, inhuman, and infinitely more patient. It was a presence that did not merely tolerate the screams, but seemed to need them, to study their texture and timbre. It was an entity that grew stronger, more defined, with every sob of despair, every prayer for death, every shred of hope that was systematically ripped from the souls trapped within. The very pain of existence was the currency of this place, and business was always booming. The asylum's very architecture was a chilling testament to this malevolent purpose. It was a masterwork of psychological warfare rendered in stone. Each hallway that twisted back upon itself in a disorienting, fractal pattern. Each iron bolt that felt unnaturally cold, even in summer. Each patient's narrow cell, all were positioned with a terrifying precision. They were arranged according to a preternatural geometry, a configuration born of principles far older than the hospital itself. As one visiting French architect, a man named Julien Vaudreuil, noted in his journal in 1781 before his body was found folded impossibly into a dumbwaiter shaft. This building is not bound by Euclidean geometry. It is a dimensional wound, a scar on the fabric of reality. Symmetry mattered, placement mattered, because what the founders of Bedlam were truly building wasn't an institution of healing. It was a ritual, and the so-called patients, the unfortunate souls who served as its fuel, were rarely insane upon their arrival. Their only madness was their inconvenience. They were the discarded lovers of powerful men, their swelling bellies a threat to noble bloodlines. They were the bastard children whose very existence was a stain on a family's honor. They were the loyal servants who saw too much a treasonous plot whispered in a study, a forbidden act in a darkened bedchamber. They vanished behind Bedlam's imposing gates, and if they ever emerged, they were something else entirely, hollowed out shells of their former selves, babbling truths too dark for sane ears to comprehend. We are told that history's greatest horrors came from war, famine, and plague. But Bedlam was an altogether different kind of evil. It was horror by design, an engine of suffering orchestrated by men who saw madness not as an ailment, but as a door, and they were determined to open it as wide as possible, no matter what came crawling through. The true genesis of this horror, the moment the seed was planted in London soil, did not begin when the first patient was admitted. It began centuries earlier, when the ground itself was first violated, in the year of our Lord 1247, during the reign of King Henry III, workmen digging the foundations for a new priory. The future Bedlam struck something that was not earth or common stone. It was a slab, massive and monolithic, of a polished black rock that seemed to drink the light of the sun. It was carved, not with any known script, but with a dizzying array of symbols that seemed to writhe at the edge of one's vision, inducing headaches and a profound, bone-deep unease in all who looked upon it. Fearing they had uncovered some pagan relic, the workmen, with a primal instinct, did not show it to their bishop, nor did they report it to the crown. They showed it to only one man, a reclusive and controversial monk from a nearby order named Alaric. He was a scholar of forbidden texts, a man who believed some knowledge was locked away for the protection of mankind. He was brought to the site and spent a day and a night studying the stone, his face growing paler with every passing hour. He did not speak, but his brothers later reported seeing his hands tremble as he traced the impossible alien geometry of the carvings. Alaric vanished from his monastery that same week. He did not pack his belongings or bid his brothers farewell. He simply walked out into the night, leaving behind a lifetime of scholarly work, taking with him only the terrifying memory of the stone. The only clue to his fate was a single word he was heard muttering repeatedly in the hours before he disappeared, a word his abbot recorded but did not understand. Exonymous. It was not a name, but a description, a classification of horror. It did not mean the lifeless. It meant that which feeds on the living. The slab was quickly and secretly buried again, deeper this time, covered with tons of earth and consecrated with frantic prayers. The blueprints for the priory were redrawn by an architect who was brought in under a cloak of secrecy, a man who never signed his name to the final plans. His only known instruction, passed down through the clandestine notes of the project's secret patrons, was chillingly simple. Place the lunatics above the mouth. And so they did, for the next 700 years. The building that would become Bedlam stood as more than a hospital. It was a lid. It was a seal on an ancient hunger. And the patience, the constant, unending chorus of screaming and sobbing that would define its legacy. That was not the sound of madness breaking free. It was the sound of something being fed. And the feeding schedule was precise, governed by a timetable not of human design. Every night, as the great city of London surrendered to the quiet dark, a silent, internal clockwork within Bedlam's walls would stir at exactly 13 minutes past 3 in the morning, a time long associated in obscure folklore with the thinning of the veil between worlds. The great iron bell in the asylum's long disused chapel tower would ring. No one pulled the ropes. Historical accounts confirm the chapel had been sealed by order of the bishop for decades, its belfry home only to dust and decay. Yet the sound would toll. It was a single, resonant peal, not sharp and clear like sanctified bronze, but a low, visceral thrum, a sound like a giant femur striking granite deep underground. It was a frequency felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled not through the air, but through the stone of the foundation, up through the soles of one's feet. Guards on the night watch reported the taste of old metal filling their mouths and a brief, dizzying vertigo. For the more psychically fragile patients, the effect was catastrophic. They would awaken not with a start, but with a seizure, their bodies thrashing as their minds were momentarily plunged into a reality far worse than their own. The toll was a signal, an announcement that the evening's tribute was now due, and in its wake, the true ritual would commence. From somewhere within the asylum's labyrinthine wards, one patient would be chosen. There was never a struggle, never a single cry for help. A bed occupied by a sleeping soul at 3:12 a.m. would simply be found empty at 3:14 a.m. The sheets would be cold, unnaturally so, as if no living body had ever been there. One orderly, a man named Thomas Croft, documented in a hidden journal how he once witnessed it. He watched a young woman sleeping peacefully. The bell tolled, a flicker of the gaslight, a gust of inexplicably cold air, and she was gone, not taken, simply absent from reality. The official log, a document of profound fiction, would mark the patient as released. The head nurse would strike the name from the roster with a single, neat line of red ink. The on-duty physician would sign a pre-written transfer form without looking up, his practiced indifference a shield against the questions he dared not ask himself. It was a bureaucracy of erasure, a conspiracy of silence enacted nightly, but the staff knew better. They understood these were phantom entries, ink on paper to mask an unthinkable truth. No family ever came, no carriage ever departed. They were simply paid in tribute. This methodical disappearance created a contagion of fear far more potent than any physical disease. Seasoned orderlies began to refuse solo night shifts, inventing illnesses or feigning injury. A frantic black market for lamp oil and candles thrived within the staff quarters, as the darkness itself was now seen as a predator. They would huddle together in common rooms, thick with sweat and unspoken terror, their eyes wide, listening. They listened not for the screams of the patients, but for the toll of the bell and the suffocating, absolute silence that always followed. They knew Bedlam was not merely decaying, it was leaking, and something was methodically thinning the herd. The source of this terror, the power behind the bell, was Bedlam's most protected and blasphemous secret. In the asylum's hidden ledger, a tome bound in cracked, flaking hide that felt disturbingly like human skin. This secret was referred to by a chillingly poetic name, the Night Choir. They were housed in a sub-basement so deep it was rumored to sit below the water table of the Thames, a wing uncharted on any official blueprint. The journey there was a descent into another world, through 3 iron gates, each requiring a different, intricately designed key, and down a spiral staircase where the air grew colder and thicker with each turn. The chamber that housed them was unlike any other part of Bedlam. There was no grime, no decay. The stone walls were smooth and seamless, as if carved from a single piece of obsidian, and the air was cold, still, and utterly devoid of the usual asylum smells of sickness and despair. It smelled only of ozone and frigid stone. It was a silence that had a physical weight, pressing in on the eardrums. A silence that was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself. The 7 individuals who formed the choir were not patients. They were instruments. Each had been handpicked from the forgotten dregs of the empire: orphanages, debtors' prisons, workhouses. Internal memos, written in a coded language, revealed the terrifying selection process. All 7 had experienced near-death hallucinations. All had been clinically dead for at least a minute before resuscitation, and all reported dreaming the same recurring dream. Before their arrival, a vast, circular room with a ceiling of thousands of unblinking eyes, and a formless black shape in the center whispering a single, seductive command: "Return to me." By the 3rd month of their confinement, the singers no longer consumed food or water. Their bodies grew skeletal, their skin waxy and translucent. Yet they did not perish. Their humanity seemed to recede day by day, their expressions becoming blank, their eyes losing the light of individual consciousness, replaced by a shared, ancient emptiness. They sat in a circle on the cold stone floor, motionless for 23 hours a day. Yet every night, at the same hour, they would begin to sing. It was not music. It was a summoning. Long, low, harmonic vibrations emanated from deep within their chests, a polyphonic drone that bypassed the ears to resonate directly with the bones. It was a frequency of pure wrongness, a sound that made the very foundations of the building tremble. A visiting priest, a respected exorcist sent from the Vatican to investigate, was found in a corridor hours later. He had ripped out his own ears with the handle of a silver spoon. Before being committed to a cell himself, he managed to scrawl a message in his own blood on the stone floor. It did not say, "They are possessed." It read, "They aren't singing, they're remembering." The purpose of this unholy choir was functional. The vibrations were a key, a sonic drill designed to open something deep beneath the asylum. The seven singers, their souls already tethered to the other side, were perfect conduits. They were the strings. Something ancient was the musician, plucking at their very life force to play its terrible song. Then came the accident. One frigid night in the winter of 1888, a fire broke out in the lower wards. The official cause was faulty oil lamps, but the flames, witnesses said, burned with an unnatural, greenish-black hue and moved with a strange intelligence. When the charred remains were counted, the numbers did not match. 2 members of the night choir were missing. Some among the terrified staff whispered that they had seen the pair walk calmly out of the inferno through a shimmering wound in the air, a doorway that hadn't been there the night before, and that snapped shut behind them. Bedlam was never the same. The summoning song had stopped, but the silence it left behind was a vacuum, quickly filled by the asylum itself. The building had awakened. It was now a chaotic and malevolent consciousness. The walls in the east wing began to weep a thick, reddish-black fluid that smelled of rust and sorrow. Clocks in the administrative offices would spontaneously reverse direction. Light fixtures began to cast shadows where there should be none. Dark shapes that flickered at the edge of vision. Staircases that had a set number of steps for centuries would suddenly have one more, or one less, as if the building itself were growing and breathing. The very geometry of the place had come unbound. The doctors and administrators who orchestrated the cover-up began to lose their minds. The head physician, for instance, was found in his office, catatonic. He had meticulously arranged every book in his vast library, not by author or title, but by the color of the eyes of the patients whose tragic cases were described within. Whatever the night choir had been trying to open was now, at last, awake, and it was hungry. This new phase confirmed what the staff had long suspected: the asylum did not treat madness. It manufactured it. Madness was now the currency, the power source, the raw material. This was most evident in the immediate creation of a new experimental ward, Ward D, known to the orderlies only as the Echo Room. It held no furniture, no windows, just a single patient at a time, placed in total, oppressive silence. But the silence never lasted. Within hours, the walls would begin to speak back. At first, it was subtle, a sound, a whisper. Then, the walls would project visions, not of ghosts, but of the patient themselves. They would see a version of their own face, aged 40 years and weeping silently, reflected in a polished tone where no reflection should be. They would hear mocking laughter that didn't belong to them, whispers that repeated their most secret thoughts. And then came the scratching. Every single patient, without exception, scratched the exact same symbol into their own skin within 24 hours, a spiral with 7 hooks radiating outwards. When a young intern tried to research the symbol, he disappeared. His employment file was erased, his name deleted from all logs. A colleague who inquired about him was shown a resignation letter signed by the intern, a signature the colleague swore was a forgery. The asylum was no longer just a container for a great evil. It was now an active and creative participant in its work, a factory for nightmares with an ever-increasing production quota. But every factory has a power source, a furnace at its heart where the raw material is consumed and transformed. And to find bedlams, one had to go deeper than any official blueprint ever dared to admit. While the asylum's administrators perfected their craft of manufacturing madness on the upper levels, the oldest and most grizzled orderlies, the ones who had worked there long enough to recognize the building's true nature as a living entity, whispered of another place. Their stories were never written down, passed only from one generation of keepers to the next in hushed tones during the dead of night. They spoke of sounds coming from beneath the floor stones, of a profound cold that seeped up from the very earth, regardless of the season, and of maintenance men who had ventured into the deepest storage cellars looking for lost supplies, only to return hours later, their hair turned white, muttering about doors that shouldn't be there. They called this place the Hollow, a nickname that was part legend, part prayer, a name for the source of the asylum's unending wrongness. For decades, this was merely a terrifying legend, but in 1812, one man, the asylum's new head physician, Dr. Pearl Ashton, sought to bring the pure light of enlightenment reason to Bedlam's darkest corners. He was a staunch rationalist who believed superstition was a mental contagion that needed to be excised. The night before his descent, he sat alone in his office, reviewing the scant, anecdotal reports from his staff. He saw the patterns, the disappearances aligning with certain lunar cycles, the localized drops in temperature, and his scientific mind worked furiously to impose a logical framework. He theorized about subterranean gases affecting the psyche, or a unique fungal growth causing hallucinations. Yet, beneath his clinical analysis, a cold knot of primal fear was tightening in his stomach. He felt the building's oppressive silence, the weight of centuries of suffering, and for the first time in his professional life, he entertained a thought that terrified him more than any legend. What if reason was not the right tool for this diagnosis? What if the scalpel he intended to use was laughably inadequate for the scale of the disease? He dismissed the thought as a moment of weakness. The next morning, he prepared for his descent not as an adventurer, but as a surgeon preparing for an operation. He gathered thermometers to record the unnatural cold, barometers to measure any changes in pressure, and a leather-bound journal to document his findings with clinical precision. To his concerned deputies, he scoffed, "We will dissect this ghost with the scalpel of reason. What is there to find but cobwebs, damp, and the fantasies of uneducated men?" He was the only man ever known to have passed through the final gate and returned. The journey itself was a descent through the asylum's hidden history. The first gate was of rusted iron, groaning in protest. The second was of cold, silent brass, bearing no tarnish despite the damp. The final door, however, was not forged from metal. It was grown from bone. It was a masterpiece of biological architecture and abject terror. Vertebrae formed the frame, their spinal processes interlocking like morbid gears. Ribs, arranged in a herringbone pattern, created the central panel, and the handle was a polished human hip bone, worn smooth by the touch of countless, dread-filled hands. The two orderlies who accompanied Ashton this far stopped dead, their lantern light flickering across the impossible sight. One fell to his knees and began to pray. The other simply turned and fled, his footsteps echoing back up the spiral stairs. Ashton, his jaw set with a resolve that was now more stubborn than scientific, proceeded alone. When he emerged 3 hours later, he was forever changed. He was blind in both eyes, though forensic reports, later confiscated by the Crown, confirmed they had suffered no physical injury. His hair, once a deep black, had turned stark white. He kept repeating a single, chilling phrase, his voice a dead monotone. "I saw the inside of the world, and it saw me." His colleagues tried to treat him, but their medicine was useless. How does one treat a man whose affliction is not of the mind, but of the soul? They saw his condition as a catastrophic failure of reason, a final surrender to the madness he sought to conquer. They did not understand that he was not mad. He was, for the first time, seeing things with perfect, soul-shattering clarity. Dr. Att Transferish Oki, Ashton's personal writings from the weeks following his return, served as the asylum's darkest and most complete confession. They were seized by shadowy agents of the Crown, but not before a terrified junior physician, Dr. Alistair Finch, secretly transcribed several pages. The act of transcription was itself a form of torture. Dr. Betty Finch later wrote in his own diary that as he copied Ashton's words, the air in the room grew cold, and he could hear the faint, wet sound of something breathing just behind his shoulder. Ashton's handwriting began as the neat, clinical script of a physician, but as the pages progressed, it devolved into a frantic, jagged scrawl. The pen having dug so deep, it tore through the paper in places. Finch found his own hand beginning to tremble in sympathy, and at one point, he looked down to see that he had automatically transcribed a sentence in a language he did not know, a string of guttural symbols that seemed to burn on the page. The very knowledge was a psychic virus, an infection of the soul that passed from one mind to the next through the simple act of bearing witness. These stolen documents did not describe a basement. Ashton described a chamber shaped like a colossal human brain, its walls composed of a soft, gray, pulsating tissue that undulated with a slow systolic rhythm. The air, he wrote, was thick, warm, and smelled of static electricity and wet earth. But beyond the sight was the feeling. Ashton described a sense of being known, catalogued, and utterly dissected by the chamber itself. He felt his own memories being sifted through like pages in a book. He wrote of a low, subvocal hum that was not a sound, but a thought, a billion consciousnesses whispering at once. He claimed it was not a chamber at all, but a living organism, a thinking, dreaming god asleep beneath London. The hollow was Bedlam's secret heart, and it demanded tribute. In his fevered script, Ashton unveiled the truth behind the nightly disappearances. On the nights of the full moon, a preternatural stillness would fall over the wards. The usual cacophony would die down into an eerie, expectant silence, as if every soul in the building was collectively holding its breath. It was on these nights that the ritual took place. An unnamed patient, once scrubbed from the records that very day, would be walked down to the bone door. That month, Ashton wrote, he was a young poet, a boy committed for excessive passion. He walked to his fate with a placid, empty-eyed expression, unaware he was about to become the final stanza in a horrific epic. It was a solemn, priestly procession led by the asylum's director himself. The patient would be led inside the living chamber, and the bone door would seal behind them. What happened inside was never witnessed. Only the aftermath was felt. Ashton's notes correlate these disappearances with seismic tremors that would shake the entire asylum, with the spontaneous explosion of gas lamps, and with a terrifying phenomenon where every patient across all wards would awaken at once, screaming a single, unified word into the darkness below. This was the true nature of the asylum's work, a truth now confessed through the hand of its own chief physician. Bedlam was not a machine for creating madness. It was a sacrificial altar. The patients were not victims of psychological torture. They were offerings, tithes of flesh and sanity paid to a slumbering, subterranean god. The madness was merely the seasoning, the terror a spice to make the offering more palatable. Ashton's journey had confirmed the ultimate horror. The thing the staff feared was not just a curse or a ghost, but the asylum's central deity, and its worship was the institution's true and only purpose. The consequences of this revelation were not legal, but absolute. The consciousness in the hollow, having been witnessed, now took a vengeful interest in the world above. Dr. Ashton, the sole witness, vanished without a trace in 1819. along with his wife and two small children. Investigators found no signs of a struggle. They found a dinner table set for four, the food cold and untouched, a layer of dust already gathering on the plates, as if they had been gone for a year, not a night. All the clocks in the house had stopped at 3:13 a.m. The only evidence they were ever there was a single line of text found carved into the wall of Ashton's former office. The hollow remembers its debt. Shortly after, quiet men in dark, ill-fitting coats arrived at the asylum. They were not from Scotland Yard. They moved with an unnerving efficiency, their faces impassive. They were agents of the Crown, members of a department that did not officially exist. They did not ask about a crime. They asked about the breach. They confiscated all of Ashton's remaining documents and questioned Dr. Pope Finch for hours, their questions revealing a horrifyingly intimate knowledge of the hollow. Before leaving, they delivered a quiet, absolute threat of what would happen if a single word of this was ever spoken aloud. It became clear that the highest levels of power were not ignorant of the entity beneath Bedlam. They were its custodians, its wardens. For the next decade, Bedlam pulsed with a new, malevolent energy. The building itself began to exhibit physiological symptoms, as if it had contracted its master's disease. The walls would sweat a foul-smelling, clear liquid that defied analysis. Paint would peel imperfect, repeating spiral patterns. Mirrors would show reflections that were subtly wrong. Visitors reported severe nausea, vertigo, and episodes of amnesia. The infection was radiating outwards. Soon, strange reports surfaced in London of streets that momentarily led nowhere, of rooms that felt impossibly larger on the inside, of a shared nightmare of a spiral staircase descending into darkness. What the founders had built was not a hospital, but a bargaining chamber, an altar to a primordial force. And the deeper one went not just through its floors, but through the layers of its secrecy. The more it didn't feel like descending through earth, but through conscience, into a place where the foundational laws of reality were beginning to fray and unravel. For over a century, this slow unraveling continued, a quiet sickness spreading through the spiritual heart of London, where the foundational laws of reality had begun to fray. But the entity, it seemed, eventually grew impatient. Its final, physical release would not come from a gradual leak, but from a single, shattering blow. In 1985, in an act of civic progress and post-industrial sanitation, the decision was made to demolish the last of Bedlam's oldest wings. It was an era of modernization, of looking forward, and the asylum was seen as a decrepit monument to a shameful past. The planners and politicians believed they were closing a book on a shameful chapter of history. In reality, they were ripping out its final page and unleashing its contents upon an unsuspecting world. The demolition crews were mundane men of steel and schedules, their days governed by overtime and safety regulations. They were wholly unprepared for the history they were about to unearth. In the first few days, they noted the strange phenomena with casual dismissal tools that would malfunction only within the asylum's perimeter. An oppressive silence that seemed to swallow the roar of their machinery, and a persistent, unnatural cold that clung to the lower levels even on the warmest summer days. Then, the excavators broke through the final, deepest foundations, and they uncovered something that was not on any blueprint, something that should not have existed. It was a vault, a hidden chamber sealed not with brick, but with massive obsidian bolts that seemed to absorb the light. The moment the vault was breached, a foul, ancient air rushed out, and the work ground to a halt. Inside was not treasure, but an ossuary, a library of human suffering arranged with the chilling precision of a mad curator. They found rows of kneecaps stacked like firewood, towers of jawbones arranged by size, and hanging from the center of the ceiling by what looked like petrified sinew, a chandelier meticulously constructed from the delicate ribs of infants. It was a cathedral of pain, a monument to centuries of sacrifice. And in the center of this grotesque collection, resting on a slab of what appeared to be fossilized tongues, was a book. It was bound in a material that was later identified as human scalp, its pages made of vellum-thin hide, its script inked in a dark, brownish-red fluid consistent with spinal marrow. Its cover bore no title, only a single, mesmerizing symbol, a circle, bent and twisted like a serpent, in the process of devouring its own eye. The sight foreman, a pragmatic man named Arthur Keene, was the first to touch it. In that moment, witnesses said his eyes rolled back in his head as if he'd been struck by lightning. He later claimed, during a brief moment of lucidity, that he had seen it all the entire 700-year history of the asylum. The face of every victim, the sound of every scream in a single, sanity-shattering second. He saw the night choir singing in their dark chamber. He felt the terror of the patient being led to the bone door. He saw the seven-hooked spiral carve itself onto his own mind's eye. The discovery unleashed a wave of death and madness upon the crew, a swift and brutal prelude to the greater plague to come. Keene, understanding what the book truly represented, walked into St. Paul's Cathedral during Sunday Mass and calmly plucked out both of his eyes, shouting a single phrase before he was restrained. "They've given it a name again. They've given it a name." He understood the final, terrible truth: to know the entity, to name it, was to grant it power over you. The book, along with the contents of the ossuary, was quietly removed within hours by the same shadowy agents of the Crown that had visited the asylum a century earlier. They arrived not in police cars, but in unmarked black vehicles, taking command of the site with an authority that local law enforcement did not dare question. They handled the artifacts with lead-lined cases and esoteric devices that emitted a low hum, as if handling radioactive waste. Before the vault was filled with concrete, they sprayed its interior with a fine, silvery mist that hissed as it touched the ancient stone. They were not merely cleaning a site. They were sanitizing a spiritual wound, performing a modern, technological exorcism. It was clear this was not their first time encountering such a phenomenon. The truth, once witnessed, could not be unmade. A single terrified worker had photographed one page of the book before it was taken. The photograph showed a diagram of Bedlam itself, its corridors and wards laid out not as an asylum, but as a complex, three-dimensional ritual glyph. The title of the glyph, translated from a pre-Sumerian dialect, was "The Dream That Consumes." The asylum was never a hospital, never a prison. It was a sigil. It was an antenna, built to amplify despair and broadcast it into the void. And now, its broadcast was complete. Bedlam as a physical place was finally gone, but its ghost, its disembodied consciousness, was now free. Its destruction was like the shattering of a plague-filled vessel, releasing its spores into the atmosphere. The haunting legacy of the asylum was no longer confined to a single, cursed plot of land. It had become a global pandemic of the soul. In the years that followed, the world began to report the asylum's symptoms. A psychiatrist in Osaka, Japan, noted with alarm that 3 of his long-term catatonic patients began humming the same low-frequency drone at exactly 3:13 a.m. local time. He recorded it, and a historical linguist later identified it as a distorted variation of the night choir's summoning song, causing the linguist to suffer from debilitating migraines for a month. In a small town in Ohio, A social worker investigating a case of mass hysteria found that over a dozen children in the same elementary school had drawn the exact same symbol, a spiral with 7 hooks. They all claimed a tall, smiling man in old-fashioned clothes with no face, just skin, had taught it to them in their dreams. The most terrifying legacy, however, was written into the blood of the next generation. A respected obstetrician in a London hospital began to notice a pattern. He delivered a child, seemingly healthy, but upon its first cry, discovered a mark beneath its tongue, a perfect, tiny spiral made of what appeared to be extra, tooth-like buds of enamel, dismissing it as a one-in-a-million anomaly. He was chilled to his core when, through quiet inquiries, he discovered 2 other, identical cases in other cities that same year. His attempts to publish a medical paper on the phenomenon were quietly and firmly shut down by the Ministry of Health, who cited public harm as a priority. The government's official stance remains, to this day, one of absolute silence. But the truth is, this bedlam was never shut down. Its walls were merely scattered, its ritual embedded into the very fabric of our society. It no longer needs a location. It only needs memory. It only needs us. And now, it has you. You may believe this is just a story, a dark history to be consumed and then forgotten. But that is the final and most dangerous deception, because this knowledge, once allowed into the mind, does not leave. A story can be a key, unlocking doors in the mind you never knew existed. Or it can be a virus, an informational contagion that replicates in the host, changing thought patterns, subtly altering perception. The story of Bedlam is both. You have been walking through its corridors since the first words of this tale were spoken. You have felt the chill from its hidden depths and heard the whispers from its echo chambers. You are encouraged to dismiss this as mere fiction, but consider the subtle dissonances in your own reality, the fleeting shadow in your periphery that vanishes when you turn to look, a shadow that seemed to move against the light. The uncanny feeling of being watched in an empty hallway, so strong you can feel the pressure on your skin. The stranger on the bus who seemed to mouth your name but never moved their lips. The recurring dream you've had since childhood. The one with the spiral staircase descending into darkness. But now, with a new detail, the sound of footsteps descending behind you. Always just out of sight, getting one step closer each time you dream it. These are not figments of your imagination. They are not coincidence. They are the first notes of its resonance within you. What you have heard tonight has changed the texture of your reality. You have, by the simple act of listening, become a part of its memory. This brings us to the deepest, most personal horror of all. The final secret that Bedlam offers. It is not about the past, but about your future. There is a reason you now feel a weight behind your eyes, an itch you can't scratch deep inside your skull. You have opened the door, and in doing so, you have become the corridor. This story is not over, because you are now an active part of it. Every soul who learns the truth becomes a new threshold, a new room in its ever-expanding, non-physical architecture. The entity doesn't need to break you down. It simply overwrites you, a slow and patient replacement of your thoughts, your desires, your very self, until all that is left is a mask of you, worn by the asylum's ancient consciousness, and every threshold opens somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, somewhere that sounds a great deal like your own voice, whispering in a room that you know should be empty. Listen, that is not your echo. It is your replacement.